Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be discussing inflation in the UK, its implication on the UK economy, UK businesses and UK consumers, and of course we're going to be applying it so you can use it in your exams or in everyday discussions you may have with people. So let's start by defining inflation. So what is inflation? Well, inflation is defined as a sustained rise in the price of goods and services in an economy. What this basically means is prices are going up and the purchasing power, or the amount that people can purchase with the income that they have, goes down. This is quite concerning for a couple of reasons, which we'll get into later, but the main reason being living standards. So obviously if you can't buy as much stuff with your income, that is going to mean that you're going to have less goods, which means that you get less utility from those goods, which means that you get a lower standard of living. And this can be something that's very concerning, which we'll take a look at later on. Maybe we should start by talking about how we work out inflation. So imagine I gave you a task, okay? I want you to tell me how much inflation there is in the country you're from. So maybe the UK, maybe the US, maybe Europe, or somewhere else from the world. How would you work that out? So I gave you this task, I gave it to you as a job, I said I'm going to give you lots of money afterwards for working this out for me. How would you do that? Let me know in the comments down below. The way that we do it in the UK and in many other countries around the world is we use price indexes. The main one of these is going to be the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Now, what the CPI uses is a basket of goods to track inflation. So what it looks at is basically everyone who consumes in the UK, it looks at what they buy. So let's say people tend to buy bread, milk, cheese, maybe. So those are goods that people tend to buy. On these, what they do is they track the price month to month. So they show how the cost of these changes month to month. And that's a good way of measuring inflation. It's also very interesting because they change the basket of goods based on what people are consuming. So for example, recently they added sports leggings. So why would they add sports leggings? Well, that's because in the UK, we've seen an uptake in people going to the gym. It's become quite trendy to go to the gym. And also we've seen an uptake in sports or athleisure clothing. So more people are buying those clothes. So to keep this index representative of the people in our country, we have to change the index. Now that does make a problem because obviously it's very difficult then to compare CPI today to CPI 10 or 50 years ago, because the base that we're measuring has changed because we've added and removed different items from that CPI. So that's one way we can use to measure CPI and to measure inflation. Another way we can use is RPI, or the Retail Price Index. Now, have a think what the difference may be between CPI and RPI. The one thing that we've missed so far is housing. That's everyone's major expense tends to be their housing, so their rent or the cost of a mortgage repayment, for example. So RPI uses the CPI basket of goods and adds the cost of housing to it. And that's an alternative way for us to work out inflation. Now, which one of these do you think is higher? Well, probably RPI because it includes housing. And this is why most things such as your phone contract, such as your gym membership, for example, use RPI to adjust the rate you pay every year, because that means the business gets that higher rate, which means obviously it's more, well, you could argue whether it's more or less indicative of inflation or not, but it's definitely better for the business to use the higher rate, which tends to be the RPI. So in the UK at the moment, we have very high levels of inflation, around 8% to 10%, depending on the month you want to take a look at. And that is obviously based on these indexes that we look at. Why is that? What's going on here? What is causing this inflation? So there are two primary causes of inflation. The first one is what we call demand pull inflation. And the second one is cost push inflation. So what's the difference between them then? Well, demand pull inflation is where prices are being pulled up by an increase in aggregate demand, or AD. Now AD composes of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So what we're going to see here is higher demand in the economy leading to higher demand for goods, which means the price of those goods have to go up to keep an equilibrium. If they didn't go up, then the market would be in disequilibrium and we could get shortages. So there might not be enough stuff. And that can be very bad. So what could have caused this could be an increase in the amount that consumers, so you and I, are consuming, the amount of investment in the economy, the government spending, so how much money the government are paying for things such as welfare payments, but also, for example, for infrastructure projects, and then our X minus M, so our trade balance, so how much exporting we're doing versus importing. If we're doing more exporting, that is an injection into the circular flow. So AD gets higher and we're likely to see demand pull inflation. Whereas if we're doing more importing, so we're importing goods and sending the money out, that is going to be a leakage from the circular flow, which means that actually AD is going to shift to the left and we're going to see less demand pull inflation or even deflation. Can we think of any demand side factors which would have led to inflation in the UK right now? Let's work our way through the elements. So with consumption, why is it that there may be more consumption today, significantly more, than there was yesterday? Well, one reason could be the pandemic. So we could have seen after the pandemic, when the lockdown was ended, people had a lot of savings and a lot of money, and there was a lot of pent-up demand because they weren't spending much when they were in lockdown. There was very limited options for spending, maybe online companies, but people weren't going out, they weren't eating out, they weren't spending out. So COVID-19 could have caused pent-up demand. And pent-up demand is then being let out, which means that aggregate demand can be increasing in the economy right now because people have money to spend. Investment then, well, we could potentially see this linked to tax cuts and other issues. Also government spending, well, we had all those policies, for example, Eat Out to Help Out, and also a lot of furlough schemes. So that's a big lot of government spending, which again has propped up aggregate demand, leading to demand pull inflation. Exports and imports is a funny one because obviously during the COVID pandemic, we saw a decline in the amount of world trade. That was because of disruption to trading caused by COVID. But now, as a result of that, afterwards, there's been more of an opening up. So potentially we could see more exports and imports, which could have an effect on AD as well. But the primary reasons are going to be our consumption and our government spending, which is causing the higher rate of inflation in the UK. Now let's look at cost push inflation. So what is cost push inflation? Well, cost push is where, as the name suggests, the costs to businesses increase, which equals higher prices. So, as the raw resources, or as we call them, the factors of production, land, labour, capital, and enterprise, increase in cost, that cost usually has to be passed on to higher prices. And this is what we call supply side inflation. So you have cost push inflation. With that then, what factors could have caused an increase in cost push inflation in the UK? Have a think. Well, there's a couple of big ones. One of them is disruption to trade. And that is obviously from the pandemic. So where there was less trading going on, it made it more expensive for countries to get the goods they needed. And that then resulted in higher costs for those goods. And that would then be passed on to consumers from higher prices. The other big factor that's causing cost push inflation at the moment is war. So we have war in Ukraine at the moment, and what that is doing is, one, it's just causing a load of disruption, so that is making it more expensive for business to operate. But secondly, because of the sanctions and the response to the sanctions from Russia in terms of not allowing the sale of oil and gas into the EU and the UK, that has led to higher prices for those necessity goods, so oil and gas. Now, all businesses use oil and gas in any type of production, even if you don't directly make a good that uses oil and gas. So for example, if you are an orange seller, you make oranges and you sell them. How are you using oil and gas? Well, the machinery that you use probably uses gasoline to run, and additionally you have to ship those goods, so those oranges, to the end location in order to sell them. And therefore what's going to happen there is your costs of transportation are going to go up. And that means your cost as a whole is going to go up, and that means you're going to have to pass on those higher prices to the end consumer. And that's going to cause cost push inflation. Let's draw this on a diagram now and show what's going on then. So what we're going to see on this diagram is GDP stroke output. Here we're going to have price levels. We're then going to have a Keynesian diagram here, so a Keynesian LRAS curve. And then we're going to have our AD curve. Now, what happened first, let me also just draw the equilibrium on here, Y1, P1. What happened first was the AD shift. So we came out of lockdown and there was a lot of spending. So that is going to lead to higher aggregate demand, so shift outwards to AD2. Here then, we already see higher prices, but also a small increase in growth as well. So you have inflation, but also some GDP growth. And we actually did see this. So we actually saw the UK economy bounce back after the lockdown was ended because a lot of people were spending money. So this is pretty realistic to what happened then. Normally in an economy, when we have demand side inflation and just demand side inflation, it isn't particularly a bad thing as long as it's controlled. So as long as it's around 2%, that is controllable. In fact, it's what we want because this actually acts as a buffer from deflation. And we'll talk about deflation in another video, but deflation can be really bad. It also shows demand in the economy. So it shows that consumers are willing and able to buy and consume goods. So it shows a lot of willingness and ability there, which is what we want to see. It shows a resilient economy. So actually some levels of inflation aren't too bad. However, the problems come when we add cost push inflation here. So what we're going to see is a shift backwards in the LRS to LRS2, P3, Y3. So what we've seen here then is this growth has disappeared because of the supply side shock caused by war and also by pandemic disruption. And additionally, we've seen more inflation, so prices have risen from P2 to P3. And that's the situation we're in right now, where we have falling growth due to this supply side reduction that we've seen going on, and also very high prices. And that's what makes this type of inflation very problematic, because it affects the productivity of businesses, it affects how competitive the UK economy is, and it leads to overall higher prices without the benefit of strong GDP growth. So that's the macro side of things. Now let's talk about the micro side of things. So how does this affect individual consumers and also businesses, individual businesses? Now I made a short form video talking about shrinkflation, and that's going to explain this a bit more here. So feel free to watch that video at the end of this one, but we'll have a look at the micro implications now. So we know that businesses' objective is to profit maximize. So pretty much most businesses, with some exception, want to make the most profit they can by selling their goods. That looks like this on a diagram. So we have quantity, we have price slash costs, average costs, marginal cost. Remember, this should cut through at the lowest point. I've tried to make it do that. AR, MR. Now, at our equilibrium point, remember, for profit maximization, that's going to be where MR crosses MC. So we follow this down, and this is what British businesses on the whole want to achieve. So I'd have a price of P1, and they would have costs of C1, which means this area in between, this box that we've created here, is their area of supernormal profit. And this is where they're profit maximizing, okay? Have a think then. So what effect is inflation going to have on this business diagram? Also, we should probably set this. So let's say this is the price of a chocolate bar. I'm not going to name a brand, I'm sure you can think of one. So this is a branded chocolate bar, okay? So this was before the inflation. What's happened now then? So we would have seen the shift in these costs because of the inflation. So because of supply side inflation, it costs businesses more to get their factors of production, which means that our cost lines are going to shift upwards. So we've got AC2, MC2, and then we have a new equilibrium, which I'll do in green, Q2, Oh, we didn't label Q1, so we should do that as well. C2 and P2 here. Now, this green box here, notice, is far smaller than the original red box. And that's because what's happened here is the businesses have seen higher costs. And as we know, profit is determined by your revenue minus your costs. So if costs go up, your profit goes down. This obviously is bad for the business. They don't want this. It means their returns are worse. They're likely going to have upset shareholders and upset managers because they want higher returns because their pay is based off of their profit and the dividends are paid off the profit. And also think about dynamic efficiency. So how this business is able to respond to a changing economic environment. When they have lots of profits, they're able to reinvest those profits and therefore adapt to the changing environment. Whereas what we see here with these reduced profits is less ability to invest, and that could then result in less dynamic efficiency and this business being overall less resilient. Now, let's say that actually this business has gone into a loss. So let's say these AC lines shift above this line, so it's going into a temporary loss. Or let's talk about, for example, if this business wants to try and even still push its profits up. What are the options it can do? Well, the first option, I would say, is do nothing. I mean, they could do that, but then as we see, they'll have to live with kind of this lower profit. So this is kind of price satisficing. So they accept this lower profit that they have to deal with for the time being, and they kind of go on with that. That's one option they can have. The second option, raise prices. Now, if they do that, then one, that's going to contribute to more inflation. So you see how there's a vicious cycle of inflation here, which is we get higher cost push inflation, which leads to higher costs for businesses. Those businesses then have to put their prices up, which then leads to higher end prices. And then those higher end prices lead to even more inflation elsewhere in the economy. So we do get a vicious cycle going on here. Additionally, if they raise their prices, we know that demand's going to fall. So we'd actually see perhaps less profit there because of that. The final option they could do, for free, is lower quality or size. And this is shrinkflation. So instead of raising prices, instead of doing nothing, what the firm will do then is they will choose to produce a smaller good in the hopes that the consumer either doesn't notice, or they will choose to reduce quality. So they may switch to a cheaper alternative for that product. So let's go back to the chocolate bar. So they may make a smaller chocolate bar, or they may use cheaper goods in that chocolate bar. So for example, rather than using real milk, like fresh milk in the production of that bar, they may choose to use powdered milk, which could be cheaper. That is going to lead to a less quality good, and it also will lead to less consumer utility because the consumer is getting a less effective good. What we see primarily today is size, and that's because of the effects of shrinkflation, which we'll talk about now. So what I've drawn here is two possible conceptions of the market for a bar of chocolate, and we said it was branded chocolate, okay? So what we had then is either an inelastic demand line, so we're saying that consumers do not react proportionally to a change in price with a fall in demand, or we have an elastic diagram. So actually the change in demand is more than proportional to the change in price. Okay. What we're basically saying there is when we change the price, how much does the consumer respond? Do they still buy the good, in which case it would be inelastic, or do they stop buying the good, in which case it would be elastic? Now, we could also technically have unit elasticity here, but that's a bit boring and probably doesn't really summarize this market properly. So which of these models do you think is most likely to be the case with, for example, a chocolate bar? Yeah, so I would say it's probably more of an elastic good. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Can you think of them? So one of the reasons would be substitute goods. So what a substitute good is it's a good made by another business or an alternative good which satisfies the same want or need as the good we're looking at here. Okay, so where this is a branded chocolate bar, if they put their prices up, consumers are likely to actually move away. They're going to go and use, for example, an own brand or a non-branded alternative. And in that case, then, it's highly likely that demand is quite elastic. So if one chocolate bar puts up their price, I'm likely to go to their rival and consume that chocolate bar instead because it's cheaper. And that's what I should do as a consumer. Remember, there is some brand recognition here, so people prefer different chocolate bars and different chocolate bar makers, so there could be a certain element of inelasticity there, because I may still buy this bar because I prefer it, even if the prices are higher. However, give or take, it's probably quite elastic. Me personally, I'm probably going to select what I'm eating and my chocolate bar based on the price. That might be because I'm cheap, but I think that's how most consumers would also act as well. So it's probably fairly elastic. So we've had this problem then, which is the shift in supply, which is caused by the inflation. And we said the solution could be they put their prices up. But now we see the real problem here. If they do put their prices up on this elastic diagram, we see a larger fall in quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So this business will be making less profit. That being the case then, how could they kind of cheat this? Well, what they do is they use shrinkflation. So they make the goods smaller without you really realizing it's smaller. So you still buy it, it stays at the same price, but you're getting less of the good. Now, this is actually a really good idea for chocolate bars because, for example, as we said, people have preference for a chocolate bar. I might still want that dairy milk. And if the only thing I'm deciding on is based on the price, well, I'm not going to pick up one chocolate bar and the other and say, look, this one's 95 grams and this one's 100 grams. I'm just going to look at the price and grab them. They look pretty similar, and they can also use packaging as a way to kind of trick people. So the typical joke is like the Pringles can, which is half full, it's all air, or a crisp packet, which is all air, for example. That's quite a clever idea, and this kind of goes into behaviour economics, because when we as consumers are trying to make rational decisions, it's really hard for us to analyse all the data that's on offer on a shop shelf. We're probably just going to pick up what we're used to picking up, that's called habitual spending, and also kind of what we have an inherent preference for, which is probably the brand. And if there's nothing which is obviously separating them, for example price, then this is far more likely to happen as well. And that's why shrinkflation is very, very clever. It's a very clever business strategy because it allows businesses to stop and kind of combat the rise of inflation, the rise of costs, without losing consumers because of higher prices. But it only works within reason. Because obviously if the things get too small or there's too much shrinkflation, then consumers will eventually pick up on it. And that can actually lead to really negative backlashes because people might say, oh, look what they're trying to do. They're trying to cheat us. They're trying to scam us. And this is kind of where we get this cliche from about kind of the crisp packets, for example. So it's an interesting business practice. If you were running a business, would you do this? Or would you be a bit worried that you might make consumers feel a little bit ripped off? Let me know in the comments down below. I hope that's been useful. I know we've covered a lot and we've crossed between macro and micro, so if you do have any questions, let me know down below. And yeah, I'll see you all hopefully in another video. Oh, and subscribe, it helps. I don't know why, but it does. Also like, that also helps, and commenting helps as well, which is why I asked for it. Economics of YouTube.